Hi everyone. I just showed you how to rig an eyeball in Animate Pro and Harmony, and now I'm going to show you the same concept of how to do it in Animate. So when you're working with Animate, it's a layer-based compositing system. So you've got your layers over here, and you have to add all of your effects and work with your effects in the layers. And so it's possible to do some types of rigs over here, of course, but it's a little bit more limited in terms of what it can do in effects. In this case, I can achieve the same effect in Animate as I can with Animate Pro. But in some cases, you just simply can't because the layers don't show enough information to be able to make those types of complex connections that we would make in Animate Pro. So let's just start off here. First thing that I want to do is I want to gather together the highlight, the pupil, and the iris layer so that I can animate all three of these together. And so I will add a peg layer to my pupil, and then I'll just drag and drop my highlight and my iris layers in there so that I can animate these three together. And you'll notice, by the way, on the pupil layer that I've put the pivot point in the center just like I did in Animate Pro so that I can dilate that pupil or contract it as needed for different scenes or for one scene. And as I mentioned also, it is not necessary for the vast majority of shots to do an eye this complex because you wouldn't see that kind of dilation on an iris or on a pupil unless you're very close. So it's a very cool type of rig to do if you have to do a close-up shot. If you're doing a bit of a further away shot, then I'd recommend that you put the pupil, the iris, and the highlight all on one layer together. And then you can just animate those together because you wouldn't see that contraction in it. But this is a very cool way of doing it, and I want to show you the most sort of advanced technique here. Okay, so now that I've got these three together, then you'll notice if I try to animate this pupil or peg layer that contains all three of these, that my pivot point is in the wrong place. So I talked about pivot points in my tip of the week last week. But in this case, I'll just use my rotate layer to drag and drop the pivot point of my peg in the center because since I'm not going to be swapping views on this drawing, it's totally fine for me just to use a peg layer fully. And then now that I've got that in the right place, I can animate all three of these elements around together, and then I can also animate these guys separately on their drawing layers. Of course, you wouldn't want to animate the position of your pupil, but you can always animate the dilation and contraction. Okay, so now the next thing I want to do is I want to isolate the white of the eye so that I can use that as a mask for my iris and pupil. So if I want to isolate the white of the eye, the first thing I want to do here is I want to add my color override effect. And then with that color override effect, if I drag and drop my eyelid layer onto it, then I'll be able to access the layer properties of the color override, and it will show me the palette here that's being used by this eye. So this now shows a very important concept also, which is naming your palette property properly, which I mentioned also in the Animate Pro video. It's almost even more critical to name things properly when you're working in Animate because, as I'm sure you guys will know, the standard Animate palette that comes in there has many, many different colors in it. It comes with like 100 colors in it. So if you are trying to isolate one color in that list of 100, it's going to be very difficult for you to know which color you're trying to isolate unless you name things properly. And even if you're working in Animate, I would also recommend getting rid of colors that you're not using because I find that it's much easier if you're going to be doing compositing, if you're going to be doing effects, anything like that, it's much easier just to have the colors that you need. Having additional colors might seem great, but it really does slow things down actually if you're going to be doing a lot of inking and painting or a lot of effects. So now that we've got our palette set up, I'll go back to my color override module, and I can take the eye white layer and I can drag and drop it into the same render selected colors only tab that I had inside of Animate Pro. And now that I've got that in there, then I can use this color override on the eyelid now as a mask with all of these other layers over here. So let's add our mask. And then when I add the mask layer, you'll see that there's two places. There's the mask that has the star next to it, and then there's a mask that has the box next to it. And you want to put the mask itself inside the one that has the box, and you want to put the original drawings inside the star. So I'll just collapse in here my pupil layer, and I'll put that inside the star. And then I'm going to take the color override with the eyelid layer and put that inside the mask. And just like when we're doing this in Animate Pro, it does the opposite of what we want. So we have to double click on the mask layer and then click on inverted. And now you'll see that it is cutting off that pupil automatically with the edge of the eye. But just like with Animate Pro, when you do this, you need a copy of the original one going back to the main timeline here so that you can access, or so that you can see it when you're animating the eye. So this is the one thing that's a little bit tricky when you're working with Animate versus Animate Pro, that when you're working with Animate Pro, you can just take that connection and you can make two connections down in your composite, and then you're just animating one eyeball. With Animate, you've got to do a clone on the selected layers. And when you clone the selected layer, you can drag the clone out. And this is all fine and good, but the only thing that you have to be aware of is that when you're animating a clone, then the drawings are tied together in the sense that if I make a change to one drawing, let's say I'm just going to take this eye and I'm going to add an X to it. So you'll see that if I make that change on one drawing, that change is also made on the other one. It's made on both clones. So that type of a change is cloned from one drawing to another. We'll just undo that. But you'll notice that the exposure here is separate. So it's kind of better if you want to animate blinks and whatnot, to animate them all on one eyelid and then just copy and paste the exposure from one to the other. That way the exposure will match. And that's really the best way of doing things in Animate. But let's just say, for example, I want to do the same thing that I did in my Animate Pro example. I'm going to extend the exposure on my eyelid, and then I also need to extend the exposure on my pupil. And so now that it's all extended, then I'll take my transform tool and I'll double check. It looks like the order here. Yes. Oh, no. Pupil is on top. Oh, I see what I did. There's some kind of a keyframe here. Let's take that keyframe out. All right. So now that I've got these guys cutting off here automatically, I can take my my pupil group there and I can animate the position to the other side, and I can do the same thing where I'm going to make it skinnier on one side to get that optical illusion as the eyeball is animating, and then I just want to remove this extraneous keyframe that I've added there somehow. So now we see it animating from one side to the other. So that's how we would do this same type of eyeball in Animate as opposed to doing it in Animate Pro. So the only real limitation here when working with Animate is that you can't do that direct connection with your eyelid, so you have to do the clone, and then when you do your clone, you're going to have to copy and paste exposure from one to the other. So that's it on the tip of the week this week on how to rig the eyeball. So stay tuned next week.